I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. Children, teenagers, and young adults in the United States are struggling with a mental health crisis that has saddled them with persistent feelings of sadness, depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts and behaviors. The problem, which preceded the emergence of COVID-19, was made substantially worse by the pandemic, and it continues. These challenges have been especially severe for young people in difficult social arrangements, such as those in foster care or other less than ideal domestic situations. We'll talk about all of this with my guest, Ronald Richter, a former commissioner of New York City's Administration for Children's Services, who is now the CEO and executive director of JCCA, a family services organization that provides child welfare and mental health services for more than 17,000 children and their families. Ron, welcome. Thanks for coming in. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So, what are your thoughts about this mental health crisis among young people in this country? And in many cases, they're in deep distress. What's going on?
So, it's something that we're thinking a lot about and learning a great deal about, but I would say that the confluence of the pandemic, which resulted in social isolation for young people, they were at home without being able to socialize with friends, go to school, in combination with the pandemic. So the pandemic and social media. So social media was an issue before the pandemic.
Right.
And the confluence of social media and the pandemic really became lethal for young people and their well-being, their mental health. And obviously, we as a country were very focused on a vaccine for COVID. But, you know, we weren't as attendant to the impact of months, in some cases years, of isolation, where young people were socializing on their phones.
Not in school.
They were not in school. They were not with sports teams. They were
Right.
not with theater groups. They were not in study groups. Young people who are accustomed to having a teacher, a guidance counselor, any number of adults in their lives, all of a sudden their life became their bedroom. And parents, as you know, were also really tripped up by the pandemic. And naturally, children look to adults for guidance. And during the pandemic, there wasn't a lot of guidance for adults to give. And so I think of it as sort of this cloud that came over us and created some darkness for children and young people. Parents very often were lenient about social media because they were worried
Right.
that their children weren't interacting with the world, and surely that was a way to do so. But I would say that the difference between now and 50 years ago or a century ago is the huge amount of information that is pummeling our young people, and you know, a long period of isolation, and here we are.
You make me laugh. It makes me feel like myself and my friends, like ignorance was bliss. So, you know, I hope not. But anyway, a big question for you. What's being done to address this crisis, and who's doing it? Who's responsible for coming up with the answers?
So I think we as a society are responsible for the well-being of young people. Obviously, young people are our future. And that's just fact. And so it is up to, I think, our government and the sector that I'm a part of, the nonprofit sector, to address the tremendous needs that we're seeing. And I think that while we've made some steps in the right direction, that's where our focus should be. It's not about, do we know how to treat depression, anxiety, suicidality? We do. The question is, are we going to leverage the resources to focus on those very serious issues? And as you pointed out, we've seen a dramatic increase in anxiety and depression and even suicidality among young people, especially girls. And we need to do something about it. It's on us.
Well, your organization has said that the state of New York is failing children with the ones with the most serious mental health issues. What did you mean by that, and how do you counteract it?
We are now at a point where New York State has really disinvested in children and adolescent services, particularly for those that we consider the highest acuity. So as you pointed out, children that are not in ideal circumstances, they may be in foster care, they may be in the shelter system. Those children are at particular risk. And at JCCA, we are really trying to provide community-based services, clinical services to those young people, and even some services designed for high-end challenges. The state, and I've been somewhat critical of the state, is just beginning to catch up. Governor Hochul has been pretty vocal about the fact that we have a mental health crisis and that we need to do something about it. The question is, how well is the state, how smart is the state being about what we fund and how we ensure that organizations like JCCA can afford to hire people to actually provide these critical clinical services.
So it sounds like that effort is in the early stages at this point. Are you optimistic about the road the state is taking here?
So as someone who's been in this business for almost 35 years, I am optimistic. Mostly I'm optimistic because of children's and young people's ability to rebound, right? The greatest thing about working with young people is their tremendous resilience. And so I think we have a great opportunity. I'm disappointed that the state is, the state's funding mechanisms, the state's requests for proposals do not contemplate what we talked about before, which is the pandemic, right? I, as a therapist with a license, can work for CVS.com and make oh so much more money at my kitchen table than I would serving our young people with the highest acuity. Going into homes in communities that are struggling, sitting at the kitchen table with a family and providing support and guidance. That's what JCCA does. We are, at this point, unable to really hire clinicians because the state's funding simply isn't sufficient for us to bring clinicians in and have them stay. It's a very challenging job, obviously, and so that's, I think, our biggest challenge today.
Why had that funding been cut back? Was it strictly budgetary reasons, or were there policy implications? What went on?
So I think that under Governor Cuomo, there was a real focus on deinstitutionalization. We didn't want anyone in what we consider institutional care. And I think that makes sense. Only children who really are dysregulated to the point where they can't do well in a foster home or in their own home and are disruptive, only those kids really need a short period in a residential setting. I think that Governor Cuomo felt that instead of any time in institutional care, young people should be at home and we should build community-based services. However,
that's the key issue.
That is the key. So if you're a 14 or 15-year-old with a very significant behavioral health challenge, you need a school in your community that has clinical services available not just to you, but to your family. Your parent needs respite so that they can actually gather the energy and focus to help you get better. And New York State has simply reduced the capacity in psychiatric hospitals for children, in residential treatment centers, without the concomitant increase in community-based services.
It sounds maddening because when you hear the term deinstitutionalization, and I remember that wave back, I guess it was in the 1970s and 80s, when they did it on a broad scale. And again, it made sense at the time, but there were supposed to be community services to take care of the folks who still needed help. and we never got the requisite community services. And then we've had all kinds of problems since then. And it sounds like they're just doing the same thing over again. I mean, does anybody ever learn? Does anyone ever look to history?
Yeah, I mean, you would think that when you have an 18-year-old in Buffalo, New York, shooting up people at a grocery store, and you realize that that individual had a history of mental health challenges that was well documented, you have to ask the question, well, how come we're not learning from that? Or the multitude of incidents going on in the New York City subway system where you have people known to the mental health system. And so I have the same question you do. We simply do not want to make upfront investments. We are reluctant to prevent what we know is going to happen. Yes, that is absolutely maddening, but we have to continue to advocate. And we have a governor who, at least unlike her predecessor, has been outspoken about the needs. The question is, how is she operationalizing that? Is she putting the money where it needs to go? Is she telling her Department of Budget and her Department of Health that we need to spend real resources so organizations like mine can hire strong clinicians who aren't going to leave after a year? And we're confronting that every day, and we're not alone.
So tell us about JCCA. What kind of an organization is it, and what's your primary mission?
So we are 202 years old. We were established to provide really cash transfers to families of immigrants who were struggling mightily, and that was in the 1820s. Really, we've evolved into an agency that supports families that I would say present with the highest acuity. That is what really distinguishes JCCA. We are interested in families where parents are struggling and children are struggling, often with child safety issues, mental health issues, and education issues. And we have evolved over the course of 2 centuries to really focus on families that have risk factors as high as a kid possibly coming into the foster care system. And so we provide care management services so that we can ensure stability for young people who have high needs. And if necessary, we have preventive services when the city believes that a child is at risk at home, and we integrate ourselves into the household and support parents. And then for those very high-end cases, we provide both family foster care and residential care, combined for about 500 children at a time.
So give us a sense of what kind of young people end up in foster care. What are their lives like, and why is it that they can no longer stay with their families?
Sure, and I want to back up and say that in 1990, New York City had about 50,000 children in foster care, and we had approximately 30% of those children in an institutional setting. Today, there are fewer than 7,000 children in foster care, and less than 9% are in an institutional setting. So I want to say that New York City, since Commissioner Scopetta in 1996, Nick Scopetta, since Commissioner Scopetta, we have seen a commitment in New York City to reduce the removal of children. We've invested tremendous city tax levy in strong preventive programs that actually provide a social worker at the kitchen table and really support families so that you don't need a removal. That means that children who would have been in foster care 10 years ago are now absolutely at home, and they're getting services. About 30% of the kids that were in foster care when I was a judge in Queens were in the shelter system with their families. So to answer your question, these are young people who are in already precarious situations, who often have a parent struggling with economic deprivation, with a few kids as a single parent trying to manage a lot of incoming, often without a social network to provide support. And we see kids who come into care who are already, struggling with medical issues, with mental health issues, and with fraught relationships with colleagues, meaning their fellow students,
Right.
children who struggle with disruptive behavior that really is a function of what happened to them 0 to 5. 0 to 5 is a critical period where a young person, a child, really needs stability and regulation, right? So we all know that children need to sleep, and they need to eat, and they need to be clean, and they need stability. And if you have adults who are overwhelmed, you often see that children become dysregulated. And we see a lot of young people coming into care now who have struggled with early childhood challenges.
Right. We're talking about mental health issues, and they're not just with young people. Adults obviously have mental health challenges as well. And you've often talked about the different approaches that we take in our society in general when it comes to, say, physical issues on the one hand, and mental health challenges on the other, with mental health often, or most often, getting short shrift. Is that still the case? And if it is it changing?
So even though we have a law in New York that requires us to provide parity for mental health services and physical health services, we simply don't follow the law. So the answer to your question is, I want to be hopeful that at least we're talking about this, which is critical. But I started my legal work at Legal Aid in the Bronx in 1991, and there were wait lists for children at various mental health centers and for parents as well. It is now 2024, and JCCA has a community-based clinic in Brooklyn and in the Bronx with long wait lists. We provide an amazing community-based service called Youth ACT teams, which are designed to encircle a family and a young person with psychiatric nurse practitioners, nurses, and others to ensure that that child at home is stable. We have a huge wait list for that service, as do other providers. So what that says to me is no. If you have strep throat, you are going to get an antibiotic promptly so that it doesn't turn into scarlet fever. We don't seem to take the same approach to mental health. And I think some of that is a function of our own biases and our own questions about whether someone really needs behavioral health service. Nobody asks, does a kid really need their strep treated? And so what you see are wait lists, and we don't consider that while the kid's on the wait list, things are not improving.
Right.
So for the Youth ACT program, it is a very difficult program to get accepted into. Often multiple psychiatric hospitalizations, sometimes a spell in foster care, parents who are really struggling. If we've got a wait list for that program, what's going on with those kids right now? And so parity might be what we call legal, but in practice, we are really falling short. And again, that's because we're not providing funding so that we can hire the clinicians to provide this critical service.
Something else that you've frequently said is that families need mental health services as well as the youngsters themselves. And I was thinking about that, and I actually got a chuckle out of it when the U.S. Surgeon General recently came out with an advisory talking about parents, and I think it's nearly half of parents in the United States say they feel overwhelmed by the challenges that come along with childcare. And it raised the question in my mind as to why parents in general feel so overwhelmed. And going back to my reference to half a century ago, is it more difficult to raise children now than it was back in those days?
Absolutely. We live in a cacophonous society.
We do.
There is noise coming at us at all times. And oddly, it isn't a family sitting around a television show in their den or living room. It's each person in their own room watching their own cacophony. And the scrolling of all of this data has made parenting much more difficult. And parents, including myself, feel concerned about what we're not doing for our children to protect them from these outside forces, right? We're all familiar with the algorithms that target our young people and pummel them with information that may or may not be appropriate for the age of our children.
Right.
And so I think parenting has become much more difficult. Obviously, the level of acrimony in our public discourse is very upsetting for everyone. And it leaks into our homes. How can it not? It leaks into our schools. People feel that they can express whatever's on their mind in a blog, in TikTok, and it has an impact on us. Our brains have only been exposed to this level of data and information in the past decade, maybe. And then we got hit with a pandemic.
Right.
And for parents recovering from the pandemic, it's tremendously difficult, especially for families like JCCA serves, who are economically struggling in most cases. So I think the Surgeon General was absolutely on target, especially where describing issues for families struggling financially.
Now, a few minutes ago, you mentioned prevention services. When we're talking about mental health, what constitutes prevention? How do you go about pursuing prevention to avoid more serious mental health challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in our early care and education programs, right, our programs for kids that are 2, 3, 4 years old, that it is very important to consider the role that parents play in children's lives. And the further upstream we go, the sooner we're introducing parents across the spectrum to concepts of well-being that include emotional well-being, the better we're going to do. Mm-hmm. So in the first instance, it's real prevention, which is informing people of how they can look at their kids and understand what they're going through, how people can talk to their children about what's going on in their lives, and feeling secure enough to bring up topics that may be uncomfortable. I think we really need to be far more proactive, like we are with healthcare, around what are the signs that we should be looking for in children, and how can we help parents understand that. So that's the beginning, right? It's making people aware that they actually play a critical role in their children's well-being. And I think that the pandemic messed us up on that. I think people were beside themselves just trying to survive. And so now it's making up for some lost time. And then we continue with all manner of services that can include clinicians when you have a kid that or a parent that's really struggling and perhaps diagnosed with anxiety or depression, and ensure that we are not stigmatizing that happenstance, right? It's okay. If a kid's depressed, a kid's depressed. What are we doing about it?
Right.
Teachers have to be far more in tune with young people. We talk about small class sizes. Part of the reason we want small class sizes is because a teacher only has 2 eyes, and if they've got 30 kids, it's harder to identify what's going on. So I think the importance of education, of talking about what's going on, and of ensuring that people don't feel stigma around naming an issue that they're seeing.
We've only got a minute and a half left, but I had mentioned that you were a former administrator of children's services here in New York City. You were also a family court judge. And my question is, how did you get so committed to these issues involving children and their families? I mean, you've been at it a really long time, and you've been really focused. Where did that come from?
So I think I discovered this when I was a family court judge, and I had to remove children, which is a very painful reality for families, for parents. I've rarely met a parent who didn't want to do right by their child. And for me, The reason I think I do this, I've discovered, is that my father was a victim of the Holocaust and was separated from his family when he was 11 years old and didn't know that he'd ever be reunited with them. And my father lived till 95, but as a result of living through that experience, and he was eventually reunited with his mother. His father had already died. You appreciate the impact of childhood adversity. You appreciate that my father struggled with anxiety and really the results of complex trauma until his death.
Right.
And so I think that's why I do this. I do this because our young people today, amazingly, they're not experiencing a Holocaust, thank God, but they are experiencing a lot of trauma. Every child loves their parent, no matter what.
Yep.
And it is up to us to help families achieve stability so that kids can be safe with their families. That's what we all want. So I wanted, to rewrite history for my dad because in many ways it had horrific impact on his life experience. And so I hope that we are doing everything we can to diminish the trauma that our young people are experiencing right here in New York City in 2024.
Well, we're going to have to end it there. This has been great. Ron Richter, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Bob Herbert, and that's it for this time, but I'll see you again next time. Take care.